Hi everyone, and welcome back to the Ravens Table. Today, we're going to talk about a game from the medieval era called Hazard. Hazard is a dice-based gambling game that requires no accessories or game boards to play. This game dates back at least as far as the 13th century, and possibly even as far back as 1125. It remained popular even up through the 18th century, with many dedicated gambling houses having been established specifically to host this game. For those of you who are familiar with the modern game of craps, you might notice some similarities since craps was actually developed from Hazard by a simplification of the rules. But before we get into how to play Hazard, let's talk history. So the name Hazard is known to have entered the English language from Old French, hazard or hasard. The origin of the Old French word isn't exactly clear, but the most likely answer is that it derives from the Spanish word azar, meaning an unfortunate dice roll. The Spanish word is thought to have come from one of two sources. The first possibility is that it is derived from either the Arabic word azar, meaning change or luck. However, this Arabic link isn't exactly certain, as the word is not always found in classical Arabic dictionaries of the era. But going back even further, the word likely entered Arabic from either the Persian or Turkish words for dice. The other possibility starts with William of Tyre, who was the second Latin archbishop of Tyre from 1128 until 1134. Tyre claimed that he and his fellow knights invented the game of hazard during the Crusades under Charlemagne. He stated that they did it to pass the time while laying siege to the castle of Hazarth in June of 1125, therefore implying that the game is named after that castle. In the late 14th century, Geoffrey Chaucer wrote about hazard in his Canterbury Tales, where he describes the game as an analogy for life with runs of both good and bad luck. Specifically in The Pardoner's Tale, Chaucer describes a great ambassador Chilon from Lacedaemon who was sent to Corinth in order to build an alliance between those two nations. And when he came, he noticed there by chance all of the greatest people of the land, playing at hazard there on every hand. Wherefore, and all as soon as it may be, he stole off again home to his country, and said, I will not thus debase my name, nor will I take upon me so great a shame, you to ally with common hazarders. Send, if you will, other ambassadors. For my truth I say, I'd rather die, than you with gamblers like them to ally. For you that are so glorious in honors, shall never ally yourself with hazarders. At the height of Hazard's popularity in the 16th and 17th centuries, the game was played on both street corners as well as in opulent gambling houses for the wealthy. In the 1540s, the word hazard entered the English language as the generic word for chance of loss or harm or risk. And finally, the modern game of craps is directly derived from hazard, having been created in 1788. The name craps even comes from a specific throw in hazard. So now, let's have some fun and learn how to play hazard. Okay, so before we get into how to play hazard, I'm going to start off with my usual disclaimer. As is the case with many things medieval or ancient, game rules aren't always set in stone. While the rules for hazard are perhaps more standardized than games like Hneftafel or Roll Game of it's still important that you agree ahead of time under which rules you'll be playing. The version I'm going to show you here today is one of the more standardized rule sets, but I do encourage you to try alternate rule sets. They may change the game in little ways or in large ways, but it usually makes the game fun. It's not quite so ritualized, and it can make things more interesting. So, as I mentioned before, the only thing required to play Hazard are two six-sided dice, marked in the usual way. We have those here. If you're going to be playing for gambling purposes, then obviously you're going to want money or tokens or something like that. Also bear in mind that this is a game that any number of people can play at the same time. So before we get into game setup and the rules, there's a couple of terms I want to cover. First off, the person who is going to be throwing the dice is known as the caster. There's always going to be a person who is the banker, and sometimes the banker is also called the setter. In an actual gambling house back in the day, the banker would have been provided by the house, just like it would have been in a modern day casino. If the caster throws a winning roll, and I'll explain what a winning roll here is in a moment, but if they throw a winning roll, that's called the nick, or nicking, and they win. If they throw a losing roll, that's called the out, or outing, and they lose. So to start the game, one person's going to be the banker, and one person's going to be the caster. All the other players can still participate, but they're limited to things like side bets. We'll go over that here in a moment. So the caster would begin by placing their wager on the table and then rolling these 2 dice. Excuse me, they're going to place their bet on the table, and the first thing they're going to do is declare a number between 5 and 9 inclusive. So they could pick 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. So they pick one of those numbers and say, and you say one of those things out loud, and that is now the main. So let's say I'm the caster, and I'm going to say my main is 7. Okay. After you declare your main, you roll these 2 dice and see what happens. So let's roll this. Okay. In this case, I rolled an 8. Well, if I were to have rolled my main, which is 7 in this case, I would have immediately won and gotten my stake back plus an equivalent amount. So if I bet 5, then I would get 10 back from the banker. If you roll a 1 or a 2, excuse me, if you roll a 2 or a 3, that is an immediate out and you lose. You lose your stake. So you match your main, you win. You roll a 2 or a 3, and that's the out and you lose. If you roll an 11 or a 12, what happens is determined by your main. If your main is 5 or 9, both an 11 or a 12 are an out and you lose. If the main is 6 or 8, then 12 is the nick and you win, but 11 is the out and you lose. And if the main is 7, as is in our example here, then 11 is the nick and you win, but 12 is the out and you lose. And if you roll anything else, it's called the chance, and you kind of enter a second round of rolling. I know this sounds a little bit confusing, but after we go through this a couple of times, it becomes a lot more clear. But let's say you did roll a chance. So our main is 7, so let's say I rolled an 8. So 8 is now the chance. What happens is you enter a second round of rolling, and in this second round, if you roll your main again, you lose. But if you roll the chance, you win. So in this example, like I said, the chance is 8, but my main is still 7. So we're going to roll and see what happens here. So, okay, I rolled a 6. Nothing happens. You just basically keep rolling until you either roll your main or the chance. Okay, 3, nothing. 5, nothing. 7 is my main, and I just lost. Okay, so let's go through this a few more times so you can kind of see how this works. So this time around, let's say my main is going to be 6. All right, so we're going to roll this. In this case, I rolled an 8. So now my chance is 8. My main is 6. Okay, rolled a 9. Nothing happens. Another 9. A 7. Another 7. 4, 5, 7, 8. So I matched my chance, and so I win. That was the nick. Okay, so let's go through another one. Let's say this time our main is going to be 5. Okay. All right, I rolled a 10, so 10 is now the chance. 7 is nothing. 8, nothing. 5. So I rolled my main and I lost. All right, let's do it again. All right, this time my main is going to be 9. Okay, I rolled a 9, so I immediately won. Let's keep the main as 9 for now. Okay, I rolled a 7. So nothing happens. So now, my chance is now 7. All right, so it's 5. 7. So I just matched my chance and I won. All right, a couple more times. Let's say now, let's go back to having a main of 7. Okay. All right, main is 7. I rolled an 8, so 8 is now my chance. All right, there's a 7. I just matched my main and lost. All right, let's keep the main at 7 for now. Okay, I rolled a 10, so now my chance is 10. 4, nothing happens. 6, nothing happens. 3, 6, 7. Rolled my main and lost. Okay, let's say this time my main is going to be, let's say, 8. Okay, I rolled an 11. So now, since my main was 8, remember, for an 8, 12 is the nick and you win, but 11 is the out and you lose, so I just lost this one. Okay. So how does gambling fit into all of this? Well, before we get into gambling, one point to note. So the caster continues being the caster until they've lost 3 times, and then the dice will move on to the next player. And then they get to be the caster until they lose 3 times, and then it moves around. And basically the die go around the table like that. Okay, so how does gambling come into this? Well, in Hazard, there are 2 groups of bettors. You have bets made between the caster and the bank, and you have bets made between other players in the bank, or even could be player to player. For the caster is obviously betting that they're going to nick or win. For the latter, once the main has been established, other players may make bets on whether or not the caster is going to win or lose. Each player's bets are made after the caster states the main, and then they put in their stakes. So, but going back to the first, how much money is the caster going to win if they nick, for example? Well, that's based on a ratio that you can see in this table that I just put up there. It is based on basically how common each one of the, or what's the odds that you're going to roll that particular number. So as you can see, there's like the main and the chance. So let's say you had a stake of 20 coins and a main of 7 and a chance of 5. If the caster were to nick, they would win 30, because basically it's 3 divided by 2 times their initial stake of 20. With the same stake, with a main of 5 and a chance of 6, they would only win 8. So it's 4 divided by 5 times their initial stake of 20. Because the probabilities of winning vary based on what your main is and what the chance is. And like I said, basically for the other players, they can bet on whether or not the caster is going to nick, or they can bet on whether or not the caster is going to out. One of the most common variations for Hazard is for players to roll dice to determine the main instead of just calling it. The player will roll 2 dice until the result is between 5 and 9 inclusive. Playing in this manner actually evens up the odds a bit, as a savvy player would always pick a 7 since it offers them the best odds. In later forms of Hazard, notably in France and England, the players could gamble against the bank, which would then decide the stake. If the player won by having his chance come up again, the house sometimes paid more than the original stake according to specified odds. In another form of Hazard from England called Chicken, the player would throw against another opponent for a specified stakes. And there's even a cousin of Hazard called Chuck-a-Luck or Sweatcloth that was played with 3 dice instead of 2. Since the invention of dice, nefarious players have sought ways to nudge the odds into their favor. There were plenty of ways of loading dice, which is something meant to make one face more likely to appear. There were specific techniques such as shaving the corners or edges of the dice slightly. You could also use sleight of hand to switch between weighted and unweighted dice. One interesting trick noted by Stephen Hart in his book, Can't, A Gentleman's Guide to the Language of Rogues in Georgian London, was to bristle a die by affixing a bristle or stiff hair of a pig to one corner or face of a die. The author does note that this technique was not without risk and probably reserved for when one was gambling against a truly drunken opponent. But perhaps the cleverest of cheats is the use of what are called tappers. These are dice that have been cleverly hollowed out so they contain two internal reservoirs, one at the center of the die and one off to one side. These voids were then connected by a fine tube. The hollow in the center was then filled with a heavy liquid such as mercury. The tricky bit is that the dice would roll fairly until they were tapped upon the table with the correct face facing upward. At this point, the weight would shift from the core of the die to the side, making it heavier so that the opposite face would be more likely to show up. Alternately, if the core was filled with beeswax, warming the die in one's hand would cause the wax to melt and to run at the outside void. So that's it for today's look into Hazard. If you look in the video description, there's a link to a document with instructions on how to play. If you have any questions, please feel free to leave a comment below, and I'd also love to hear suggestions for future video topics. Be sure to stay subscribed for more videos looking at gaming history, as well as how you can make your own games and accessories. So until next time, I wish you luck and look forward to seeing you again at the Raven's Table.